Hello, U.S. history classes. And this week, we are starting a brand new unit. We're going to focus on westward expansion and all the different things that are tied to that, like industrialization. Now, what's interesting about this unit, and one of the difficult things about this unit, is it's not like the Civil War and Reconstruction stopped and then this sort of thing happened, all right? The things that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of weeks are happening simultaneously, especially during Reconstruction. All right. And you're going to see that with today's lesson on the Transcontinental Railroad, okay, and Cowboys. So, like I said, it's not like Reconstruction stopped and then all of a sudden we're going to build a railroad. No, This is going on simultaneously. All right. Now, I will say that the Civil War had kind of disrupted our focus on the West. All right. I talked about this a little bit a couple weeks ago. We had acquired all this territory out west due to the War for Texas Independence and then the Mexican-American War. We had gotten all that western territory. We were moving people out there, and then the Civil War kind of came and disrupted all that. All right, so now we're going to pick back up with getting people out west. And what we're going to talk about in this lesson are two of the iconic images of the American West, the railroad and then cowboys. All right, now let's start with the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1867, the Central Pacific Company started laying tracks headed east from California. At the same time, the Union Pacific Company started laying tracks headed west from Nebraska. Now, there were already railroads around the country, but we didn't have a railroad to connect both sides, the East Coast and the West Coast. All right, and that's what these two companies wanted to do. All right, I'm going to show you a map here in a few minutes that shows you the ultimate goal. All right, so 1867, both these companies start laying tracks in their respective directions, and the goal is to meet. It takes them about 2 years. In 1869, the nation finally has its first transcontinental railroad. All right, 1869, the nation completed work on its first transcontinental railroad, and it met at a place called Promontory Point, Utah. All right, and I noticed that the point got cut off there in the presentation, but it's Promontory Point, Utah. That's where the two ends met. Okay. Now, what is a transcontinental railroad? Well, let's break it down. It's pretty simple. Trans means across, and continental, of course, means continent. So you put it together, and it's a railroad that crosses the entire continent. That's what a transcontinental railroad is. It's a railroad that crosses the entire continent. Okay? Now, by 1890, more than 200,000 miles of rail lines zigzagged across the United States. And these railroads really do two things for the country. Number one, they're going to boost a lot of industries, okay, because they make long distance travel possible. All right, they're going to boost a lot of industries like iron, steel, coal, lumber, and glass. All right, so because it makes long distance travel possible, it helps industries grow. And if you look, the iron and the steel and the coal and the lumber, those are industries that are directly tied to the railroad because you need iron for the rail lines themselves. Steel is going to be used to make the trains and the cars and everything. Of course, coal is going to power the trains, and lumber is also going to be used in the rail tracks and the rail lines. All right, so these industries are tied to the railroads. The other big thing it does is it increases trade among cities, towns, and settlements. Okay. Finally, all these little towns and cities that are out west that had previously been kind of isolated, if a railroad comes through or they can get to a railroad fairly easily, that's going to help them grow. That's going to help them thrive, and that's going to increase trade in these little areas. So because it makes travel quicker, because it boosts industry, because it boosts trade, and I'm not going to lie, it also moves people quicker, the Transcontinental Railroad is responsible for the growth and westward movement. Okay, because it makes travel, long distance travel easier, trade is going to increase, those industries are going to increase, and the number of people that we can get out west is going to increase as well. Okay. Now, that being said, the actual construction of the railroad is not easy. It is very, very difficult and very, very dangerous. All right. You're going through basically uncharted territory. You're going up hills and down hills. And of course, you can only have a certain grade for the train tracks themselves. So that's going to require dynamiting of the area and things. So building the railroad is very, very difficult and very, very dangerous. Those who did the work, there are a couple of key groups that did the work. You have Chinese immigrants, and we'll talk more about them later this week with waves of immigration. You had Irish immigrants, and we're going to talk about them a little bit later this week with waves of immigration. You have desperate out-of-work Civil War veterans. Remember, we talked about those veterans coming home. Their lives have been destroyed. Their property has been destroyed. A lot of them are looking for work. Here you go. Help build the Transcontinental Railroad. And we got this whole new group of people that is looking for jobs, those newly freed African Americans, those newly freed slaves. And because the work is difficult and dangerous, the railroad companies need as many men as possible to help build these tracks, okay, and help build these lines. So the Chinese, Irish immigrants, out-of-work Civil War veterans, and African Americans are going to be key to helping these railroads grow. Now, I had told you, here's the map. Now, here is the Union Pacific, okay? Here's the Union Pacific line right here, all right? This is Promontory Point right there. Here's the Central Pacific, all right? And I know your question is, well, why is that a transcontinental railroad? Because the Union Pacific starts here and the Central Pacific starts here. But notice it connects in to all these other lines that are already crisscrossing the country. Okay, so these lines here and these lines here are going to connect in to the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, and those two lines are going to be here at Promontory Point. So it is a true continental railroad. All right. One of the things that the Continental Railroad does is it necessitates the creation of time zones. Okay, so you got Pacific time, you got Mountain time, Central time, and then Eastern time, because you want to make sure everybody's moving correctly. All right, so there's the Transcontinental Railroad, and you can see it is a true continental railroad because all the different lines are connecting into those two. Now, besides the railroad, the other iconic image of the American West is the American cowboy. Cattle ranching had become big business after the Civil War. It had started before the Civil War, and then the Civil War kind of disrupts things, and then it picks up after the war. So the years immediately before and immediately after the war are known as the era of the American cowboy. Westward movement. Now, we've been talking a lot about the West, okay? Let's define what the West is. The West is the vast region between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean, okay? That is what is considered the American West. That whole area here on this map, here's the Mississippi, okay? And then here's the Pacific. This whole area right here is considered the American West, all right? Well, you got all these people moving out there. All these people are going to need food. What's the source of food? Cattle. Ranchers raised longhorns. Okay, that's a specific type of cattle. Think about Texas, the Texas Longhorns. And they learned to be ranchers from the Spanish. Okay, the Spanish had come over. They had taught the Mexicans how to raise cattle, and then the Mexicans had taught us. Okay, so it all goes back to the Spanish. All right, the Spanish taught us how to be cattle ranchers. And like I said, growing cities, all these people coming west, has spurred the demand for beef. They need food. So you need somebody to get the cattle from place to place so they can be butchered and turned into beef for these people that are coming to these new cities. And that's where you get the cowboys. Cattle ranchers drove their cattle over the Chisholm Trail. Okay, the Chisholm Trail went from Texas to Kansas. And then when they got to Kansas, the cows were loaded onto rail cars. There's another industry that is supported by the railroad. And from there, the railroads took them to Chicago. And we're going to talk about Chicago a little bit later this year. Chicago becomes kind of the hub of the meatpacking industry. Okay, so cows are driven over the Chisholm Trail from Texas to Kansas. In Kansas, they hop on the train, and the train takes them to Chicago, and there they're butchered and turned into beef. Now, once again, okay, as opposed to what we see on television or in movies and things like that, a cowboy's life is not glamorous. It is very, very difficult. You can expect to work between 10 to 14 hours a day in all kinds of weather. Cows move very, very slow. They are not the most intelligent animals to deal with. So you have to be on your toes, keeping watch and making sure they're moving so that you can get to where you need to get to at the right amount of time. And there is no off days. You're going to be moving through snow. You're going to be moving through wind and rain and everything. There's no downtime, okay? Because you got to get the cows to Kansas and then from Kansas to Chicago. Cowboys rounded up their cattle early in the morning and headed out on the long cattle drive. And then they would stop at night. They would kind of bed the cattle. And I'll be honest with you, some people are probably going to have to stay awake to make sure the cattle don't wander off. Okay. And then you get up the next morning and do it all again. The journey from the plains to the shipping yards in Kansas covered hundreds of miles of unfenced open land in the American West. Okay. And that's going to be a key. The land was unfenced. All right. If you're moving these big herds of cattle, you can't be stopped. You got to keep moving. All right. So the fact that the land is unfenced is going to be a big deal. And I'll explain why here in just a second. As big a deal as it is, again, on television and movies, and it is important. I mean, we wouldn't be talking about it if it was important, but the days of the cowboy did not last long, okay? The days of the open cattle range did not last long for a couple of reasons. Number one, there was some pretty significant weather events, all right? There were a lot of bad weather. There were droughts, windstorms, things like that. And one of the things is you're moving cattle, you got to have a good supply of grass and water so that the cows stay alive on the journey. Well, these significant weather events, this bad weather, dried up water supplies and also killed grass supplies, okay? And that's going to make it hard to move cattle across the open range, okay? And as more and more people move out west and they claim this territory, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson, as more and more people are moving west and claiming territory, they're building farms and they begin to fence off their land with barbed wire. Barbed wire is going to bring an end to the long cattle drives and to the cattle ranching because land that was previously open is now closed off. And those cowboys that need to move the cattle along, they're moving west and they keep coming up against these barriers, okay? And something happens called the range wars between townspeople that have settled and have started fencing land and these cowboys that are trying to get their herds to the railroad station, okay? There's a good movie called Open Range that deals about the conflict between the cowboys and these ranchers, these townspeople that have now moved in, and kind of the animosity and hostility between the two groups, okay? If a cow runs into barbed wire, it's going to get torn to pieces, okay? Because the thing about barbed wire is if you get caught and you struggle, it gets worse, okay? And cows panic when they get into barbed wire, and it's not pretty, okay? So you got barbed wire tearing up cattle, you have conflicts with the ranchers, you have difficult weather that is taking food supply and water supply, and that is going to number the days of the cowboys out west, okay? Now, those are two iconic images of the West, the railroads and the cowboys. Where we're headed next in our next lesson this week is we're going to talk about getting people out west, because that's what we want to do is we want to populate the West. The railroads are going to help with that. Of course, that's why we have the cattle drives, so we can get beef to these different places where all these people are coming. So that's what we're going to focus on in the next lesson, are the people that are moving out west and how we're going to get them out there.